Hi everyone, welcome to my updated royal icing tutorial. Now, you can't have good cookies without a good base. You have to have the best royal icing you can have to get the best results. I've gone through all the issues before and I have the best recipe for you. So let's get into it. To make this icing, this is what you're going to need. 2-pound bag of powdered sugar, 3 tablespoons of meringue powder, 2/3 cup of water, 1/4 cup of corn syrup, 1 tablespoon of butter bakery emulsion. I get a lot of questions on what this is, and this is a butter flavor, and they come in tons and tons of different flavor. This is my favorite go-to for my icing, and I also add it to my cookies. And I'll also make sure to link it in the description of the video. 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract or imitation vanilla extract. And last but not least, one of the most important things, 1 teaspoon of white gel color. Okay, so I'm going to start putting my paddle attachment on. We don't want to use the whisk here. We want to use the paddle if you're using your KitchenAid. If you don't have a KitchenAid, don't worry. A regular stand mixer is just as fine. And we're going to add our powdered sugar and our meringue powder together, and we're going to give it a little stir just to mix these two together. Just enough to combine them and make sure they're evenly spread, and then we can go on with our wet ingredients. So now we're going to go add some water. So I have 2/3 cup of water, but I'm not going to add everything at once. The environment changes royal icing, so sometimes you need more water, a little bit less water. It depends on your exact measurements because a little bit of water goes a long way. So I'm going to put about half to 2/3 of it right now, and we can always add more after if we need it. It's going to start to look really ugly before it comes together, so trust the process here. I'm adding my 1/4 cup of corn syrup, and you can see it's kind of coming together right now, but it's having a tough time because it's very stiff. So I'm going to add a little bit more water here to loosen it up. And then what I'm going to do is just scrape the sides of the bowl to make sure that everything gets nicely incorporated. Notice what it looks like right now. It kind of looks like a glaze, like it's not really that royal icing fluffy look. So if your icing is like this, it's undermixed. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the butter bakery emulsion. You can leave the butter flavor out if you don't have it, that's totally fine. It's just my preference, and I feel like it just cuts the sweetness a little bit and adds a little bit more dimension to the icing. It pairs really well with the cookie as well. There's tons of other flavor like marshmallow, cream cheese, lemon, and some mixed flavors as well, so you can really turn this icing into anything you'd like. And always make sure to keep scraping the bowl right down to the bottom because some of that icing doesn't get mixed in really well. So you want to make sure that you get everything in nicely incorporated. I use real vanilla because I do like the flavor of it, but you can see it's tinted my icing a little bit of an off-white color, but we don't have to worry about that too much. You can use imitation vanilla extract or clear vanilla extract, whichever you'd like. And again, it's optional if you don't have it on hand. It's just for flavor. So if you don't have it and you really want to make cookies, you can skip it. That's totally fine. And we're just going to continue to mix, and I'm going to add my 1 teaspoon of white color. Now this is really important. Consider this like an ingredient. If you don't want color bleed, you need to add this to your icing. And now we're going to go ahead and whip our icing a little bit. So it's still a little bit liquid, and I may have put a little bit too much water in the beginning. And that's okay, we can totally fix this. But until I'm done whipping my icing, I don't want to add any more powdered sugar to stiffen it up because I want to make sure it's at the perfect consistency. So now I'm going to just turn it up to about midway here. And you can see it's whipping it up a little bit. Now this will incorporate just enough air to get it nice and fluffy and thicken it up. So now it's looking pretty good. You want to make sure you don't go more than like 30-45 seconds because if you overmix it at this stage, you'll get a crumbly icing, but you won't know until your cookies have dried. So it'll be too aerated and crumbly. So here I'm just going to add a couple of spoons of powdered sugar because it's a little bit too soft for my liking. I'm trying to get my icing to my outline consistency. because I don't want to make it too stiff and too runny. I want to get it right away to my outline consistency so I can color it, thin it down, get my flood, and get going. If you have another mixer that's not quite as strong as a KitchenAid, that's totally fine as well. Just keep that in mind when you're mixing it. You might need a little bit longer, maybe another 30 seconds to get it nicely whipped. You don't want to go for like 2, 3, 5 minutes and kind of crazy whip it. It looks beautiful, but then when it dries on the cookies, it's very crumbly and the icing doesn't hold up very well. So now this is looking pretty good. You can see all the lines in the icing are staying where they are. Nothing's melting together. If I move it around a little bit, it's holding its shape, but it's still kind of soft and glossy. So that corn syrup gives it a nice shine, a softer bite, and it gives that icing some flexibility. So that's why we add that, and it's very important. You can leave it out if you don't have it on hand, but if you can get your hands on it, it really, really helps the icing out. And you can see all the lines and the textures that I've made, nothing's moving. So that's a perfect outline consistency. And when I give it a good jiggle, you can see it's starting to smooth out. So that's what I'm looking for in my outline. Because not only do I use it for my outline, I also use it for my detail or very small sections. Sometimes I will use my outline icing like this icing, and I will squiggle it with my scribe and get it nice and smooth if it's really small. That way it doesn't crater on me and it looks really nice and puffy. Then I'm going to go ahead and cover it with a damp paper towel. Make sure you always cover your roll of icing or it's going to start to crust over on you and it won't be good. So let's go and color our icing. So which one should I go for? Let's do super red. Red is a really hard color to get, so let's do it together. So I'm going to put some of my icing in the bowl here. Do you see how it kind of blobs down? This is my outline consistency. Look at that nice soft peak. So it's not melting down, a soft peak, it's kind of moving slowly. That's what we're looking for here. So again, this is my outline consistency and I use this for my details. If I give this a really good firm shake or I wiggle my spatula, you'll see that it'll smooth out, but otherwise it holds its shape and that's what we want, to hold the flood in. We're going to use Chef Master Super Red and we're going to start with a few drops. Whenever I color my icing, I always start with a few drops. I kind of know and how to gauge on how much icing I have in the bowl, but I still get it wrong. It's always better to do less than more because it's much easier to add color than have to add more icing and make it thinner and maybe not end up with so much icing for other colors. So a lot of people have difficulties with red icing. So the most important thing is to have a good color. So some of the colors aren't as strong as others. So if you're going to use a gel color, I like to use Americolor or Chef Master. There's a few others that are available that also give you a nice strong color, but certain ones aren't as strong. And so if you're not getting the results, try a different brand and see how it works. It does take quite a bit of color to get those reds and blacks and really dark strong colors. So just be patient. And I find using a spatula is much easier. I used to mix with a spoon all the time, which is fine as well, but getting yourself a nice smaller spatula, it's flexible and I find you can mix the icing a lot faster and it kind of prevents less bubbles because you're sort of smashing all the bubbles versus whipping them in. So now you can see I had to add more color. It's still quite light pink. So as you mix more, it starts to look lighter and lighter because we're incorporating all the color. Make sure you're getting right to the bottom of the bowl and you're getting all that icing underneath. And you want to mix it in really well before you start to see the true color. It always starts off a little bit dark and you think you're getting there, and then as you mix more and more, you get more of that white icing combined, it gets lighter and lighter. So it's a little bit of a process, but it's definitely doable. And always remember that when you have this color here, it will not dry this color. It always dries a little bit darker. So don't go crazy with the color either, because sometimes you end up with a really deep color. You can always do a little test as well. So I have a paper towel here. I'm just going to take some icing and I'm going to just swipe it on here and let this dry. And that'll kind of give you an idea of what it's going to look like when it's dry. So if you're not sure if you should add more color or not, this is a good little test as well. So we're almost there. So I've been kind of working with this icing for a little bit. The sides, because I've got icing up top there, it's going to start to crust over. So if you get this, you can just cover it with a damp paper towel and that icing will soften up again. It'll be okay. So we're going to let this sit for a little while. If you have, even 5-10 minutes, it'll deepen the color a bit. So you can already notice there's a difference. You can see my sides have sort of melted back. They haven't really stayed crusted over, so that's good, so I can scrape them back in. And so time also deepens color. So if you have the time, it's good to do it. So if I'm doing a set and I have red and black, the hard colors to do, I will make those colors first. So while I'm doing the other colors, and while I'm thinning down the other color icing, then it has time to sit and develop and it'll become darker and darker. And then I like to add a couple final drops so I get almost to the color that I want. Then I'll add a few more drops just to solidify that color, make it nice and strong, and we're good to go. So now I'm gonna get a nice tall cup here. I've got my bags here. These are bags specifically to pipe without tips. So I've got them linked in the description of the video. You can see my icing is nice and bright red now that it's sat for a little while, and I've put the bag nicely over the cup and we're gonna fill it up with our icing. This is the easiest way to fill these bags. Otherwise, it's really hard to hold the bag and it just becomes this huge mess. So I like to get the biggest bag possible, usually like a 12-inch bag, because it leaves me a lot of space to be able to tie a knot at the top, and that really keeps the icing in the bag really nice, especially with your flood, because sometimes when you're squeezing on the bag, the flood comes out at the top. So I like to tie knots if I have enough room. Sometimes I fill the bag really high if I've got a lot of cookies to do. So I've taken about a quarter of what I have in the icing, maybe a little bit less, and this is gonna be my outline icing. So I've colored it, it's good to go. We can bag it up. I'm gonna tie my knot here. And the rest of the icing I'm gonna use for my flood, but I've got to thin it down with some water first. So these are the tipless bags, and you can see there's a seam running down, and there's only one seam on this bag, and it's really, really thin. It's not kind of folding or popping out of the bag. And that's the difference between like a regular plastic piping bag and tipless bags. There's only one seam to it. And because if you have a really thick seam, when you cut the bag, it'll sort of pull the icing and it won't come out nice and smooth. So here's the rest of my outline icing, and I'm gonna thin it down with some water. So I just am adding a little bit of water at a time. A little bit of water goes a long way with royal icing, especially when it's kind of at that point where it's not quite outline, not quite flood. So just very, very little at a time. And I'm gonna stir it in very good. And see how it's starting to get glossy and smooth again. See how it's kind of melting. It's that soft peak is really soft. Like it's holding a peak, but it just flops over. This is way too soft for your outline. So if you are at this point, when you first mix your icing together, you got to add a little bit of powdered sugar because this is a little bit too soft. It won't hold your details like you want them to. But this is not good enough for our flood, so we do need to add some more water. What we want our flood to do is settle nice and evenly. So we don't want our flood to kind of have marks in it or lines. We want our flood to be kind of settle level, nice, flat, and smooth. So I'm just gonna keep adding water until I find that it's coming to the right consistency. And I like doing it this way, coloring my icing, taking some out for my outline, the rest becomes my flood, because I don't have to color two separate bowls and try to make them the exact same color. Here I'm using the exact same color. One's a little bit thinned down, but the color is pretty much the same, and it'll dry the same and you will not notice a difference. So let's take a look at our flood here. It's kind of still plopping off of that spatula, so it's definitely not ready. Some people prefer a thicker flood. You know, it's kind of melting together. It takes a little bit of shaking. And if you like a thicker flood or you're doing really small cookies, like mini cookies, this might be good for you because then, you know, it won't run off the side of your cookies, but it's not quite what we want. It's that plopping, you don't really want that. So this is kind of like the ribbon test that I do to see if my icing is ready or not. So for me, this is too stiff still, so I'm going to add a little bit of more water. And you can see it's really not that much water, but it does make a big difference. So here you need to start being careful about how much water is going in. And right away you can see it's a lot looser. When I'm scraping the icing together, it's kind of flowing together and smoothing out. Now, consistency is really hard to get right. I still mess it up here and there because sometimes it looks good, and as the icing sits, it gets a little bit thicker, sometimes get thinner the next day. So there's all these factors, but just think you can always add a little bit of water. You can always add a little bit of powdered sugar to make it the right consistency. Okay, so to test my flood icing to see if it's right, I'm going to cut a line between the icing and see how it's kind of flowing together and that line is starting to disappear. That gives me a good indication that we're really close or this is about the right consistency. And I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to slowly let it go. It kind of plops down, but it also ribbons. And you see that ribboning of the icing and you see how it's sort of melting together and those lines are starting to disappear. That's kind of the consistency you want to go to. A little squiggle and it starts to melt into each other. You can maybe add a touch more water at this point, but sometimes I'll think about my set and think what kind of cookies. If they're really big cookies, I might do it a little bit thinner so the icing kind of flows faster and I can flood faster. If I'm doing smaller cookies or I know I have a lot of sections that are smaller to flood, I might keep it at about this consistency, a touch thicker, just so the icing isn't too flowy and runs off the side of the cookie. But you can see with a little jiggle, it smooths out perfectly, so this is our flood. Now importantly, we're gonna have to cover this one for a little bit with a damp paper towel because we want the bubbles to rise. So let it sit for 10-15 minutes or how long you can, the longer the better, but you can see all those bubbles here that have risen to the top. The more loose your icing is, the more bubbles you're gonna get. So what we wanna do is just run our spatula at the top of the icing here and I'm just popping all the bubbles. You can probably sit here and pop those bubbles forever. There's going to be so many of them, little ones underneath the icing that keep surfacing, but don't worry about those ones too much. Just worry about the main big ones that you see on the surface. You don't have to get all of them, but this really helps if you're getting a lot of bubbles in your icing. Make sure you do this step. And again, while I'm doing my outline and I'm bagging it all and I've thinned down all my icing, if I've got 4 or 5 colors going, by the time I've mixed down all my icing to flood consistency, I do one color at a time, I go back to the first color and all the bubbles have risen. So you can see here my consistency is just perfect and we go ahead and we can bag that. Now we're going to do it the same way. We put our tipless bag over top of our cup and you can see the difference. I don't have to spoon this icing in, it's just going to flow right into the bag from the bowl. Consistency takes a lot of practice. The more cookies you do, the more you'll realize what you like. Like I said, some people like thicker ones. I like a thinner one because I find it saves me time, but it also depends on what I'm going to do in the cookie. So larger cookies, I will go with looser flooding because it saves me a lot of time trying to smooth it out. And smaller cookies, I keep it a little bit thicker. And here we go. We're just going to tie this up. So if you don't have any space at the top to tie this, with a knot, you can just get yourself a little clip. So I have got these little bag clips here and you just clip them atop. Make sure to twist the bag a few times just so the icing does not come out, and make sure you got a nice strong clip because you don't want it to pop open while you're pushing on your bag to flood. Now, when we go to cut our bags, we want to make sure the seam is in the middle and we want to flatten out the bag as much as possible. So push that icing up a bit, flatten the tip out nice and flat, take a nice sharp pair of scissors and cut a very small hole. We always start off small and we cut bigger as we need. So you can see it's just a tiny little tip that I've cut off. And then we're going to go and test our icing. And what I always do after I make a small cut, I will do a line and see maybe a couple lines to see if it's flowing nicely. If the hole is too small, it takes too much pressure. Is the icing curling when it's coming out of the tip? Then that means the hole is not big enough and we need to cut it slightly bigger. So here's my outline that I've just drawn. And now we're going to cut our flood bag. And again, we're going to do a little bit bigger because the flood, we want the hole a bit bigger because we want more icing to be coming out. So not too big again. We're not cutting this huge hole, just slightly bigger. And I'll show you the difference. See how loosely it comes out and it kind of puddles there at the end, and how it flows a lot smoother and freer out of the bag. So that's our flood. And you can see it kind of spilling out of my bag there as well. And again, just to show you the difference, here's my outline consistency, and see that little peak it's holding. And then we go to our flood, and if I do the same thing with my flood, you can see the peak instantly almost disappears. So that's the difference of what your outline and your flood should look like. So once you're finished decorating your cookies for the night and you got to continue tomorrow, you can wipe your tip clean. So I usually use like a damp paper towel, and then I flatten the tip as much as I can. I'm pushing the icing all the way up in the bag. And then I will fold the tip over and kind of roll it up, and this will keep my icing from leaking out. And then I'll take a freezer Ziploc bag, one of these really big Ziploc bags. And then I'll take that kind of folded bag. And they don't always stay. If you have a lot of icing, sometimes it doesn't, but I try to fold it up as much as I can and kind of push it into the corner. And then I'll do the same with the other bag as well. I'll just kind of fold it up as much as I can. And usually if you've done a bunch of decorating, you won't have like a full bag of icing left. And then I just fold it up again and I'll put in the Ziploc bag, and I'll do this with all my colors, and I'll stick it in the fridge until I'm ready to decorate the next day. The reason I refrigerate them, I find that it separates less. Sometimes your flat icing tends to separate the color a little bit from the actual icing, and you got to knead it together. And it's totally fine if it does that, but I find putting them in the fridge when I'm not using them, it really helps that from happening. Now, if I didn't use all my icing, I can always just put it in a container. So I'm going to freeze this icing for another day. So I've put it in a container here. I put a piece of saran wrap, and I'm going to touch the saran wrap to the icing and make sure it's nice and flat to the sides. And then I'm going to put the lid on top and freeze this icing. This is a great way to store any excess icing that you have, and you can use it at a later date, and it lasts for like 2 to 3 months, and it's totally fine. You can defrost it on the counter and then go ahead and use it again. Now let's see our outline here. It's looking pretty good. It's holding its shape. It's flowing nicely. It's not breaking on me. If your outline is breaking, it could be too dry, so too much powdered sugar. It's too stiff. And if it's flowing too fast, then it's too loose. And then we're going to go ahead with my flood, and we can see as well the flood is kind of coming out nicely, nice and glossy and smooth. That color is really nice and bright red. And a little tip too, if you want a nice bright red, if I find my red went a little bit too dark, or I'm worried it's going to get too dark, what I like to do is add a touch of lemon yellow, the really bright yellow. And I find that it brightens it up just a little bit, and it really works well, especially because for Christmas red, I really love like those bright red, or for Valentine's Day. That's what I usually do to my reds to make a nice, bright, vibrant red. So you can see this flood is almost done here, and you can see there's still lines in there. So this is a little bit stiffer than normally, but I'm going to be using this set for some smaller cookies that I want to do, so I don't want to make it too loose. But with that scribe giving a little bit of a jiggle, you can see how smooth it's come. So if you want to not do so much scribe work, you can do a little bit looser. And it just turned out so beautiful. The color looks great. The flood looks amazing. And this will be the best royal icing you've ever tasted. Now this is my cookie fully dry, and look at that icing. It just looks beautiful. I'll have the full recipe and steps written in the description of the video. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you give my icing a try. If you love the icing, please let me know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next tutorial. Happy baking!